G'day, this is Chris Savage from Ariel Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of Israel, Past, Present and Future. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thanks for coming along. Well, thank you for coming along. We're into session 7 of Israel, Past, Present and Future. We're currently in that section where we're looking at the Mosaic Covenant and the Law of Moses. We're down now to looking at the Sabbath. And pretty much this entire study will be dealing with the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath was the sign, the seal, and the token of the Mosaic Covenant. So as long as the covenant was in effect, the Sabbath law was mandatory, had to obey Sabbath law. Now, dispensationalism teaches that since the law of Moses has now been rendered inoperative, then the Sabbath command no longer applies. However, covenant theologians, with their insistence that the law of Moses is still in effect, also insist that the Sabbath law still applies. So they actually totally ignore the fact what Moses wrote about the Sabbath observance. They even change the day of the week, turning the Sabbath into Sunday, which the law of Moses did not allow. This is covenant theology. So the apologetics that they use for mandatory Sabbath keeping are almost exclusively based upon the Hebrew scriptures for obvious reasons, because there's nothing in the New Testament that speaks about it. So there's no New Testament commandment for believers in general or Jewish believers in particular to keep the Sabbath. None whatsoever in the New Testament. And so many Jewish believers also insist on mandatory Sabbath keeping as well. However, they're a little bit more consistent in their practice, because they at least retain it with the 7th day of the week, which is Saturday. Saturday is a Sabbath, not Sunday. They claim that Sabbath observance is part of the New Covenant is absolutely nowhere supported in the New Covenant scriptures themselves. In fact, anything they would teach, if anything, they would teach the exact opposite. The New Covenant teaches nothing regarding the Sabbath laws. Now, is the Sabbath a creation ordinance? What does that mean? Does it mean that it was something that began at creation? Now, a major argument used to support a mandatory Sabbath observance is based on the concept that the Sabbath is a creation ordinance. Now, and the passage that is used is Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. And on the 7th day, God finished his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and hallowed it, because that in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So covenant theology and many in the Messianic movement say, yes, the Sabbath is a creation ordinance based on this verse or these two verses. Now, if keeping the Sabbath was a creation ordinance, it would be mandatory for both Jew and Gentiles, okay? Since remember, at this point in the story, there's no distinction between Jews and Gentiles. It doesn't exist back in Genesis. So even if it is accepted as a creation ordinance, it still would not be obligatory upon all. Why? Well, for instance, marriage is a creation ordinance, because we see that in Genesis chapter 2, verses 18 to 25. But that doesn't make it mandatory for all. If it's a creation ordinance and it's all mandatory, it means that everybody should be married. But in the New Testament, celibacy or singleness is considered an equally valid option. And Matthew 19, verses 10 to 12, and also looking into 1 Corinthians 7, verses 1 and 7, speaking about singleness. Paul says it's a great thing to remain single. However, Genesis 2, verses 2 to 3 does not contain an ordinance, okay? The passage does not issue any command, no command whatsoever for the observance of the 7th day. It says nothing about what man should do on the 7th day. it only states what God did on the seventh day, not what man did. The crucial Hebrew term Shabbat is not even used. There's no mention of man, only of God in Genesis 2:2-3. So the climax here is not upon the creation of man, but upon God's own triumphant rest. Now, Sabbath observance is not found among the Noahic commandments either, the covenant that God made with Noah, nor among any of the commandments God gave to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Also, there is no record of its practice between Adam and Moses. In fact, the words of Job, for instance, Job, he lived 500 years and more before Moses. And if you read the story of Job, his experience discloses the spiritual life of what the pre-Mosaic saint was like. He didn't have any written scriptures, and he was striving to know his whole duty to God. And yet, Job and his friends refer to creation. They talk about creation. They talk about the flood, and they talk about many of the details of human obligation to God, but not once do they ever mention the Sabbath. Now, in the New Testament, Genesis 2:2-3 is not treated as a creation ordinance, but it is treated eschatologically as Messiah's salvation rest. If we were to look into Hebrews 4, verses 3-4, the writer of Hebrews uses the passage to teach that salvation rest is rooted in the Hebrew scriptures. It also interprets typologically the future heavenly rest. Now, we're going to look at that a little bit further on. Now, just in summary, why isn't the Sabbath creation ordinance? Well, first of all, Genesis 2 does not use the name Shabbat, but it says the seventh day. Second, there is no command that it be obeyed as a day of rest. Third, there is no record of anyone keeping the seventh day prior to Moses. And fourth, in the scriptures, the seventh day is emphasized as a day of rest or a cessation of work, but not as an observance. It just says it's a day of rest. It doesn't tell you that you must do it. It just says it's a day of rest. There's no command. So there's no basis pre-Moses for mandatory Sabbath observance for Jewish or Gentile believers on the basis of Genesis 2. So if the Sabbath were a creation ordinance, it would be obligatory upon Jews and Gentiles, not just Jewish believers, because in Genesis 2, it was only Gentiles. It was only Gentiles who were living at that time. Jews didn't come till after Abraham. Now, the perpetuity of the Sabbath. Now, those who argue for a mandatory Sabbath observance on the basis of the law of Moses will often refer to Exodus 31, verses 13-17, which states that the Sabbath is to be observed throughout your generations. That is, it'll also, that's in verse 13. In verse 16, it is to be a perpetual covenant. And also in verse 17, it's to be a sign between God and Israel forever. Now, according to those who want to keep mandatory Sabbath keeping, these terms show that the Sabbath obligation continues, although many parts of the Mosaic law are no longer in effect, such as the sacrificial system, Levitical priesthood, they're no longer in effect. So what they're saying is that because of these words, throughout your generations, perpetual covenant, forever, it means that it just continues on forever. However, while the English terms throughout your generations, perpetual and forever, do tend to carry concepts of eternity, that's not the meaning of the Hebrew words themselves. Classical Hebrew, which is biblical Hebrew is different to modern Hebrew today. Classical Hebrew had no word in it that actually meant eternal, none whatsoever. Hebrew term for forever, which is olam, means a long duration or antiquity or futurity. So the Hebrew forms mean nothing more than until the end of a period of time. And we see it in ad olam or le olam. Now, what the period of time is must be determined by the context where the passage is, or determined by related passages, like how we take any scripture. It may be the end of a man's life, or it could be an age or a dispensation, but it does not mean forever in the sense of eternity. This is in the Hebrew scriptures. When I examine the usage of the same terminology in other passages, this verifies this point also. For instance, olam is used to mean nothing more than up to the end of a man's life in Exodus 21, verse 16. It says in 21:16, then his master shall bring him unto God, and shall bring him to the door or onto the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. What it means here, it's not means for eternity, it just means for the rest of his life. Deuteronomy 5:17, very similar. And you shall take an awl and thrust it through his ear unto the door, and he shall be your servant forever. Again, not for eternity, but until he dies, for the rest of his life. 1 Samuel 1, verse 22 uses olam this way. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I'll bring him, that he may appear before Jehovah, and there abide forever. Again, not for eternity, it's just simply for the rest of his life. 1 Chronicles 28:4, howbeit Jehovah the God of Israel chose me out of all the house of my father to be king of Israel forever. Now, David did not rule over Jerusalem for eternity, but he did rule for the rest of his life. So you can see by the usage in these passages, it doesn't mean for all eternity, it just means for a duration of time. And other examples where olam means only to the end of man's life is Exodus 14:13, which we see on the slide there, Leviticus 25:46, 1 Samuel 20, verse 23, and 27, verse 12. So olam forever simply means to the end of a period of time, depending on the context. Another way the term was used is when God said that he would dwell in the Solomonic temple forever. In 1 Kings 9, verse 3, this was Solomon's prayer. You said, I've heard your prayer which you've made before me. I've hallowed this house which you've built to put my name there forever. Now, and my heart shall be there perpetually. We got two of them there. Same statement we see in 2 Chronicles 7, verse 16. However, we know from history that God left the temple in the days of Ezekiel. So obviously, forever here or in perpetuity meant the age or period of time for the first temple only. Deuteronomy 23:3, the concept of forever is clearly limited also. We see the Ammonites and the Moabites. God says they should not enter the assembly of Jehovah. Even to the 10th generation shall none belonging to them enter into the assembly of Jehovah forever. Forever there simply means, or olam there simply means 10 generations. 10 generations, that's all. Okay. Even more relevant, we see same term is applied to other facets of the law of Moses besides the Sabbath, such as the kindling of the tabernacle, lampstands, Exodus 27:21, Leviticus 24:3, the showbread, the ceremony of the showbread, Leviticus 24:8, service of the brazen altar, Exodus 30, verse 21, Levitical priesthood and priestly garments, we see a lot of passages here, Exodus 28:43, 40, verse 15, Leviticus 10:19, Numbers 10:8, and on and on. Sacrificial system, including sacrifices and offerings, again, Exodus 29:28, Leviticus 7:34. Also the Yom Kippur sacrifice, which we see in Leviticus 16, verse 34. So all of these simply means it's forever, simply means it's applied for a time, not for eternity. So if it is insisted then that the Sabbath is still mandatory based on the English word forever, then the same thing would have to apply to all these other facets of the law of Moses, sacrificial system, the priesthood, all those things. Yet those who insist on mandatory Sabbath keeping will insist that the Messiah has put an end to all the others, okay? Not the Sabbath, all the others where the word olam is used, except the Sabbath. What about the term perpetual covenant? Well, same thing. It's also used with the ceremony of the showbread in Leviticus 24:9. It's the same thing. It's just for a time period. Throughout your generations, also limited in time. Used of man's life in Leviticus 25:30, Levitical priesthood in Exodus 40 verse 15 and Leviticus 10:9. The ceremony of the lampstands, this is where it says throughout your generation. Ceremony of the lampstands, Exodus 27:21. Service of the brazen altar, again, Exodus 30 verse 21. Sacrificial system, Leviticus 7 verse 36, Numbers 15:15. So when it says even throughout your generations, it doesn't mean throughout all your generations for all eternity. It's got a time limitation on it. It's time limited. So what do we conclude with this? It is inconsistent exegesis to insist based on such English terms as forever, throughout your generations, and perpetual covenant. The Sabbath law is still mandatory without incorporating all these other elements from the law of Moses for the exact same reason, because they all have the same word olam linked to them. We can't just pick and choose. Got to be consistent. Okay. We know that the law of Moses has been rendered inoperative. That's the clear teaching of the New Testament. Messiah, the law of Moses has been rendered inoperative with the death of Messiah. We covered that some few lessons ago. The Sabbath, which was a token, the sign of the Mosaic covenant, no longer applies either if the law of Moses doesn't apply. That token doesn't apply either. So if the law in its totality no longer has authority over any individual, it is no longer the rule of life, well, then the Sabbath doesn't have a rule over the individual either. And we did all this, as I said, several lessons ago. Now, we know that the law, again, from previous, we know that the law is divided, it has ceremonial, civil, and moral distinctions in it. And, you know, even those folk today who insist on keeping the Sabbath, they also realize that the majority of the law of Moses no longer applies. And so what they try and do is to make some of the laws relevant and need to distinguish then between different types of commandments. So what do? The practice here is that they divide Mosaic law, which we know is one unit of law, into ceremonial, legal or civil, and moral commandments. Now, remember, Bible views the law as a single unit. Remember James, I think it's James 2:10, he says, if you break one law, you're guilty of breaking all 613. So it's a unit. So to separate them into ceremonial, legal or civil, and moral, that's good for studying purposes if you want to study each of those 613 laws. But folks who think you can do it like that based on this division, many have come to think that the believer is now free from the ceremonial and the legal commandments, but is still bound to the moral commandments of the law. So they take out two parts of the law and they just keep the moral parts of the law. So then they view the Sabbath as a moral commandment. And so they said, okay, well, the Sabbath is a moral commandment, therefore it's still obligatory. However, the Bible makes no such distinction of the law. When we separate it into ceremonial, civil, and moral distinctions, that's not biblically inspired. That's not Holy Spirit inspired. That's just us, men, dividing it so they can try and say we need to keep the moral part of it. Now, the next question is the Sabbath law moral or ceremonial? Is it a moral law or is it a ceremonial law? Yeah. We know that those distinctions don't happen. So But if let's say, for instance, it does it. Let's just say, for instance, it does it. Which part of the law does the Sabbath fit into? If it is a moral law, then those believers who do not keep the Sabbath are now immoral. So in order to be logically consistent, those who believe that the Sabbath law still applies must accuse all those who do not keep the Sabbath, or at least the Jewish believers, as being immoral people. That's if the Sabbath law is part of the moral commandments. However, the law of Moses did not treat the Sabbath as a moral issue. It's a ceremonial issue, okay? And the requirements of what one must do or not do on the Sabbath day all have ceremonial aspects and not moral aspects. It's a ceremony. Certainly, things like the adultery law, that's a moral commandment, okay? Adultery is always wrong, regardless of the day of the week. So it's not just Saturday when the adultery is wrong, it's all the time. So the very thing forbidden on the Sabbath day, which is, you can't work and can't do all those things, you're allowed on other days. So obviously the actions themselves are not moral actions. So it can't be part of the moral law. It must be a ceremonial law. So the Sabbath is clearly a ceremonial and not a moral commandment. So if those who are pushing mandatory Sabbath keeping insist that the moral law is in effect while the ceremonial and civil laws are not, then the Sabbath then has to be done away with because it's a ceremonial law. If they insist that the Sabbath law is a moral commandment, then those who do not keep the Sabbath must be declared to be immoral. So what do we conclude? Well, not only is there no basis for mandatory Sabbath keeping based upon the Sabbath being a creation ordinance from Genesis 2:2-3, there can be no valid grounds for mandatory Sabbath keeping from the law of Moses. Finished. Also, there's no basis for mandatory Sabbath keeping based on the moral law because it's not one of the moral laws, not one of the moral commandments. What about the Sabbath in the New Testament? Yeah, we looked at the Sabbath right back when we looked at the Israel past. We covered back then. But if we were, the survey of the Sabbath in the New Testament will be studied in several categories. We're going to look at it in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, in Paul's epistles, and in the book of Hebrews. Now, the Sabbath in the Gospels. In the Gospels, there are three major areas of conflict between Yeshua and the Pharisees. And they are the fact that he was proclaiming himself to be the Messiah, and also he was challenging the authority of the Mishnah and the rabbinic traditions, the oral laws. Jesus says, you have heard it said, that's the oral laws. And some of those things were the washing of hands and fasting. They're part of the oral traditions, the man-made laws, not the God-appointed laws. And also the other thing where he is in constant conflict with the Pharisees was over the proper way of observing the Sabbath. He was in conflict with the Pharisees pretty much most of his ministry life. Now, in rabbinic Judaism, the Sabbath had actually become an end in itself. In fact, the belief was that Israel, this is what the rabbis believed and what they taught in their oral traditions. They believed that Israel was created for the purpose of observing the Sabbath. So God created Israel so that Israel could now observe the Sabbath. And what happened was the Sabbath now became highly personified, and the Sabbath was looked upon as Queen Shabbat or Malkat Shabbat, and as a bride. In fact, they'd swing the doors open on Saturday for synagogue, and they would sing welcoming in Queen Shabbat, Malkat Shabbat. Now, by creating many additional Sabbath rules and regulations, the Pharisees had made the Sabbath rest a huge burden to the Jewish people. And Jesus, Yeshua, accused the Pharisees of totally misconstruing the purpose of the Sabbath. The purpose of the Sabbath was for what? It was to help man, not to enslave him. But with all their man-made laws, they had now enslaved the poor Jew. It is the human element of the Sabbath that should be emphasized, because the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. In fact, Jesus tells us that in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. The Sabbath was made for Israel and not Israel for the Sabbath. Also, as the Messiah, Yeshua is the Lord of the Sabbath. He tells us that in Matthew 12, verse 8. And therefore, he can permit what they forbid and forbid what they permit. He's in charge. Now, there's no question, though, that Yeshua observed the Sabbath in the manner prescribed by the law of Moses. He did everything perfectly in the law of Moses, though it was not always in the manner prescribed by rabbinic Judaism, which was their man-made laws. Still, this is not sufficient grounds to insist that Jewish or Gentile believers are obligated to keep the Sabbath just because Yeshua did. Yeshua lived under the law and obeyed every one of the 613 commandments which were applicable to him, whether they're in the category of moral, ceremonial, or civil laws. Every one of them he obeyed perfectly. And now, to insist that Jewish believers keep the Sabbath today because Yeshua kept it would also require Jewish believers to keep all the other commandments today, down to every jot and tittle, including those that most of these covenant theologians and a lot of these messianic Jewish congregations classify as ceremonial and civil. Now, the commandments of Yeshua. He gave many commandments for his followers to keep, such as those which we see in the upper room discourse. And some of these commandments were also in the law of Moses. However, the Sabbath was not one of them. So, in regard to the Sabbath, there is no basis for a mandatory Sabbath keeping from the Gospels. So, right, we've seen the Gospels. What about the book of Acts? In the book of Acts, the Sabbath is mentioned a total of 9 times. First time, Acts chapter 1, verse 12, it's used to measure the distance between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. It says a Sabbath day's journey, which was around about 1,000, or a little bit less than 1,000, a little bit less than a kilometer. It was about 3,000 feet. All other references relate to the Sabbath observance in the synagogue in the book of Acts, Acts 13, 14, verse 27, verse 42, verse 44, chapter 15, verse 21, 16, verse 13, 17, verse 2, and 18, verse 4. All of those where it mentions the Sabbath is in reference to the synagogue, Sabbath observance in the synagogue. So we can't draw any conclusions about mandatory Sabbath keeping for Jewish or Gentile believers based on these passages. These passages actually refer to Jewish unbelievers in the synagogue and say nothing about the meeting of the church. Now, Paul attended these services. Why? Because evangelistic purposes. He went there to preach Jesus. And those who became believers because of Paul's preaching in the synagogue, they left and they established a local church. No passage in any way indicates that the day of the week in which these churches met was the Sabbath. It was the Sabbath. In fact, right throughout the book of Acts, there's not a single reference to any church meeting on the Sabbath. Now, this is not to deny that there were Jewish believers present in synagogues during the period of Acts, because they were. But there's no command in the book for Jewish believers to hold corporate worship on the Sabbath. Also, the presence of Jewish believers in the synagogue was not the meeting of the church, okay? There are, of course, many reasons Jewish believers may have continued to observe the Sabbath as a day of rest, especially within the land of Israel. These may have been for reasons of habit. We've done it since can walk, social pressure, fear of sanctions, Could have been missionary policy, as in the case of Paul, got to go amongst them and preach Jesus to them, or it could simply be conservative leadership in Jerusalem, or it could have been personal theological convictions as well. So it wasn't mandatory, but they still kept it because they wanted to. And there's no command for Jewish believers to observe the Sabbath either as a day of rest or a day of worship, nor is there a single example in the book of Acts of any local church, Jewish or Gentile, holding their meetings on the Sabbath. None of them. There are two other passages in Acts that may have a bearing on the question. The first of them is Acts chapter 15, verses 1 to 29, which records, this was a Jerusalem council meeting. Initially, that was about circumcision of the Gentiles in verse 1, but later it expanded to include the keeping of the law of Moses in verse 5, Acts 15. So this passage largely deals with what Gentile believers should or should not do, rather than what Jewish believers should or should not do. That's what it was all about. Paul had to find out from the council what was going on. A couple of things here we'll see regarding the practice of Jewish believers. Peter states in verse 10, now therefore, why make you trial of God that you should put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? What's he talking about? He's talking about the yoke of the law of Moses. He said, if the Jews, the fathers, and we, the disciples, weren't able to keep it, there's no reason to force it upon the Gentiles and ask them to do what even the Jewish believers could not do. So it's obvious here that neither circumcision nor even the Sabbath observance was laid upon the Gentile believers to keep. Because Peter says, what are we going to do that for? Peter's statement implies that neither are these things obligatory for Jewish believers anymore. And Peter's words might mean that Jewish believers were equally exempt from the law of Moses. Now, whether this is or it's not, the fact remains that nowhere in this context in the Jerusalem Council is there any requirement for Jewish believers to keep the Sabbath. Second passage is Acts 21, verses 20 to 24. And they, when they heard it, glorified God, and they said unto him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of them that have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they have been informed concerning you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after their customs. Now, there's no specific mention of the Sabbath here either, but that would certainly be part of the law of Moses, wouldn't it? And their customs. So it says the law and their customs. Passage here it's only dealing with what Jewish believers in Jerusalem practice, and it says nothing about mandatory Sabbath practice. To infer from this passage the requirements of Sabbath keeping would be to infer too much here. It's just not there. The Sabbath is not the only commandment of the Mosaic law. It's just one of 613. Certainly, the zealousness of the Jerusalem Jewish believers for the law included much more than the Sabbath, and would have included ceremonial and civil elements as well. Now, what does the passage teach us? Well, what the passage teaches us is that Jewish believers have the freedom to observe the law, but this is far from saying that they're required to keep all the law. It allows for voluntary Sabbath keeping, but not for mandatory Sabbath keeping. So insofar as the book of Acts is concerned, there's no support for mandatory Sabbath keeping for Jewish believers. In the epistles of Paul, in all of Paul's writings, the Sabbath is mentioned in only one place, in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 to 17. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a feast day or a new moon or a Sabbath day, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is Messiah's. So this passage here follows on from Paul's discussion in verses 8 to 15 of Colossians 2, in which he points out the ordinances that were against us, he's putting all of us here, have been blotted out by the death of the Messiah. And it is for that reason, he says, that we no longer have the obligation to keep the law, because death of the Messiah blotted that out for us. Now, among the specifics Paul mentions are issues of meat and drink, feast day and Sabbath day. Now, like other aspects of the law, The Sabbath day also is merely a shadow of things to come. He said it's all a shadow of things to come. In Hebrews 8, verse 5, the whole tabernacle system was a shadow, which is one of the reasons it no longer constitutes an obligation on earth. In Hebrews 10, verse 1, the law, especially the sacrificial system, was also a shadow that is no longer obligatory. Same is clearly true in this passage of the Sabbath. So as a shadow, its observance was previously obligatory. You had to do it. But now that the light has come, the light is Jesus, the shadow no longer constitutes an obligation because the light is now here. If Sabbath keeping were mandatory, then failure to keep it would put the violator under divine judgment. That is exactly what the context of this passage says is no longer true. Now, there are two other passages in Paul's writings that don't mention the Sabbath, but they relate to the question of the Sabbath. First passage is Romans chapter 14, verses 4 to 6. Who are you that judge the servant of another? To his own Lord he stands or falls. Yes, he shall be made to stand, for the Lord has power to make him stand. One man esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each man be fully assured in his own mind. He that regards the day regards it unto the Lord. He that eats, eats unto the Lord, for he gives God thanks. He that eats not unto the Lord, he eats not. He gives God thanks. So what we see here is that in verse 4, there's a prohibition against fellow believers judging one another concerning practice in various areas. Now, one of these areas of concern, it says the observance of days. If this is not limited to the Sabbath, it would certainly include it because it's a Sabbath day. According to verse 5, one man is free to esteem a day as being more important than another, be it Saturday or Sunday, while another can view all days equally alike. Both options, Paul says, are valid. Believers who do not keep the Sabbath should not judge those who do so as legalists, unless those who choose to do so make it mandatory for all other believers to do it the way they're doing it. Jewish believers who do choose to keep the Sabbath should not judge the Jewish identity or loyalty of other Jewish believers on that basis, because this passage here strongly argues against mandatory Sabbath keeping for either Jews or Gentiles. All day, any day you can, whichever day you want to keep it, whatever you want to do. Second passage is Galatians 4:10. You observe days and months and seasons and years. Again, in the context of the book of Galatians, the issue is clearly the law of Moses. And you can see it in all those passages. Galatians 2:16, 2:19, 2:20, 3:2, 3:5, 10 to 29, etc., etc. The months in the verse, in you observe days and months, the months in the verse refer to the new moon festivals, okay? The seasons refer to the 7 holy seasons, the feast seasons of Israel. The years refer to the sabbatical year and perhaps the year of Jubilee. The term days is the Sabbath days. Paul clearly plays down their value either as a means of salvation or even as a means for a believer living out his lifestyle. He says, you observe days, months, seasons, and years. He says, you don't need to do that anymore. In conclusion, in none of his writings does Paul ever state that it is mandatory for all believers to keep the Sabbath, or that it is mandatory for Jewish believers to keep the Sabbath, while for Gentiles it's not. He says nothing like that at all. You can do whatever you want to do. What about the book of Hebrews? Well, this treats the Sabbath typologically rather than literally as a day of worship. Now, is this unprecedented? No, it's not. This epistle, it was written specifically to Jewish believers. It mentions nothing at all about mandatory Sabbath keeping. And this is also true of the other epistles written specifically to Jewish believers, such as James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. None of them speak about keeping the Sabbath. In Deuteronomy 12:9, if we go back into history, Deuteronomy 12:9, we have the concept of rest. It's closely associated with the Sabbath. It's already associated typologically with the land of Israel. He says, Deuteronomy 12:9, For you are not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which Jehovah your God gives you. Now, this may also be intimated in the Gospels, actually, because the statement that Yeshua makes concerning spiritual rest in Matthew 11, verse 28 to 30, immediately precedes the report of two conflicts with the Pharisees over the proper way of observing the Sabbath, which you can find in Matthew 12, verses 1 to 13. Matthew 12, 1 to 13. And then going on into Luke 4, 16 to 21, Yeshua used the Sabbath day to proclaim his messiahship in Nazareth and to proclaim salvation rest. And then in John chapter 5, verses 1 to 30, in the context of one of the Sabbath conflicts, Yeshua offered heavenly rest. So, two portions relate to the Sabbath question. The first, this is in Hebrews 4, 3 to 4. For we who have believed do enter into that rest, even as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. Although the works were finished from the foundation of the world, for he has said somewhere of the seventh day on this wise, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. Now, what's the author's point here? The author's point here is that his teaching on salvation rest is based on the Hebrew scriptures. Okay? The specific reference is to the seventh day of creation, which we saw back in Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3. God's creation rest is here being interpreted typologically as referring to the present salvation rest. Second passage is Hebrews 4, verse 9. There remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Okay, the term Sabbath here refers to the Sabbath of the law of Moses, which is here interpreted typologically in reference to the future heavenly rest. That's Hebrews 4. Conclusion, what can we conclude? Well, there's no basis for mandatory Sabbath keeping in the book of Hebrews. So far, we haven't seen anything in the New Testament. So, neither the Hebrew scriptures, nor the law of Moses, nor the New Testament demand that believers today keep the Sabbath. The teaching of the New Testament is clear. While the day of the Sabbath has never been changed from the seventh to the first day of the week, there is no longer any obligation to observe the Sabbath. The Jewish believer, freed from the law of Moses, has also been freed from mandatory keeping of the Sabbath. Though there is nothing in the New Testament that prohibits him from keeping the Sabbath if he wants to. If he wants to keep it, he can keep it. There's nothing to stop him from keeping it. So not only is he free to keep it, he's also free to observe it in any manner in which he'd like to keep it, either strictly as a day of rest, which was the way the Hebrew scriptures proclaimed it, or a day of worship, which was a much later development. The point is that the day is purely optional. And in fact, no particular day of the week must be set aside. Individually, each believer, Jew or Gentile, has the option to choose whether he will set aside a day of rest or not. And if so, which day of the week will he choose to set aside? Now, corporately or congregationally, the church must meet. Hebrews 10:25 tells us, don't forsake assembling yourselves together. But the choice of the day of the week is determined by each individual congregation. So if you want to meet on a Tuesday and your congregation decides it, you can meet on a Tuesday. What about Sunday? Okay, Sunday. Covenant theologians often insist that Sunday is now the Sabbath and that Sabbath laws apply to it. Is Sunday the Sabbath? Now, in many circles, including Messianic Judaism and Seventh-day Adventists or Seventh-day Adventism, it has been taught that Sunday worship universally began with the Catholic Church in AD 321 with the law of Constantine, or if it wasn't 321, it was 364 with the Council of Laodicea. Historically, Sunday worship was a very universal practice of all churches outside the land of Israel by the beginning of the 2nd century. They also clearly pointed out that in those early days, while Sunday was viewed as a day of worship, it was not viewed as a Sabbath. Later on, church councils ratified a practice already common, and only then did they begin to apply the Sabbath rules to Sunday. In the beginning, it wasn't like that, though. Sunday was simply a day of worship, but not a day of rest. As church history developed, more and more Sabbath laws from the Hebrew scriptures were applied to Sunday, and this concept is present to this day. Now, the New Testament never, ever switched the Sabbath to Sunday. There's no such thing as a Christian Sabbath any more than there's a Jewish Sunday. Sunday is never called a Sabbath day. Okay, Sunday is the first day of the week. It's also never called the Lord's Day, although the early church fathers certainly did use that term for Sunday. It was not so used in the New Testament. New Testament never calls it the Lord's Day. The one place where the term appears is in Revelation chapter 1, verse 10. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet. Okay, now, simple reading of this, you would assume that the Lord's day was a Sunday. That's when John had this vision. In fact, there's good reason to believe it was not a Sunday. In the Greek text, the term Lord is not a noun, all right? It's an adjective. So Revelation 1 verse 10 would be better translated as, I was in the Spirit on a Lordy day. On a Lordy day. The term does not refer to a specific day of the week, such as a Sabbath, Sunday, or Saturday or Sunday. It was a day in which John was so enraptured by prophetic and divine ecstasy, and he received a divine revelation. It was a day in which he fell under the control of the Spirit and this is the Holy Spirit, and was given prophetic inspiration. And for him, it was indeed a Lordy day. It was a magnificent day. It's true that by the 2nd century, churches observed Sunday as a day of worship. It's also clear that the Pauline churches in the 1st century observed the first day of the week as a day of worship. Now, in Jewish reckoning, first day of the week was from sundown Saturday to sundown Sunday. Acts 20 verse 7 says, and upon the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread. Okay, the church of Troas clearly met on the first day of the week. Paul just tells us that in verse 7. However, it should not be assumed that this meant Sunday morning at 10:30 or at 10 o'clock, all right? That's customary for us to think today. For Jews, the first day of the week happened to be sundown Saturday until sundown Sunday. And it did not begin with the midnight hour, which our days begin with. It began between Saturday and Sunday. In fact, the church of Troas had its meeting on Saturday night, the Jewish Havdalah. This is Shabbat's closing ritual. Once Shabbat is finished, once you see the 3 stars appear in the sky Saturday evening, boom, the believers now got together as believers in Messiah. And that's when they got together to worship. Upon the first day of the week, we were gathered together to break bread. So, we see here that Paul prolonged his speech until midnight. So Paul's intention, we see in verse 7, it was to leave the next day, so prolonging his message until midnight. And verse 8 says there are many lights in the upper chamber, so it was obviously dark. The lamps were being lit to show it was Saturday night. And what else happened? It says he talked with them for a long while, even till break of day. Man, he must have talked a long time. Now when that poor fellow fell out and died. So Paul left at daybreak, which is Sunday morning. So evidence is strong that the practice of the church meeting on the first day of the week began with Jewish believers within the land of Israel itself. And since Jewish believers continued to attend the synagogue during Saturday and on Saturday morning, they needed another time to gather together as believers. They did so on the first day of the week, which was around about 6 p.m. Saturday afternoon. In Jewish timetable, the first day of the week begins at sundown on Saturday and not at midnight on Sunday. So while the Jewish believers did meet on the first day of the week, it was Saturday night, Sunday morning was actually a work day. Now, the Talmud Even the Talmud, it contains an implication that the first day observance began with Jewish believers, because in the Talmud, it's written up in the Babylon in Talmud 10:27b there on your screen. It says, on the eve of the Sabbath, they did not fast out of respect to the Sabbath. Still less did they do so on the Sabbath itself. Now, why did they not? This is Rabbi Yohanan says, a question was asked. Why did they not fast on the day after the Sabbath? What's the day after the Sabbath? Sunday. Rabbi Yohanan says, because of the Nazarenes. Now, the Sabbath is a time of eating, so Jews generally do not fast before or on the Sabbath. The question is, why not fast at any time on the day after the Sabbath? The answer here that Rabbi Yohanan says is to avoid showing any respect to the day the Nazarenes regard as special. Who was he talking about? Jewish believers. And the significance of this quote from the Talmud is that Jewish believers were worshiping on the first day of the week. As with the Jewish believers' practice of observing the law, the New Testament only states what the early believers did on the first day of the week. Nowhere is the first day of the week an obligatory day of observance. It's not. Nowhere is there a command the church must meet on the first day of the week. However, if you want to meet, it's all right. It's not wrong to do it. You can meet, you can do it, but meeting on a Sunday is not mandatory for the Christian church. You can meet any day. Any day you want to decide, you can meet together for corporate worship. Not a problem. Okay. That's where we're going to leave it for this session. And we'll see you again next session, next week. Study hard, grow strong. Thanks for coming along.